Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here in person as well as to our global audience online. It is my distinct honor and privilege to have with us Ann Neuberger from the White House. She is the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies, and really at the helm of much of the U.S. government's response to all kinds of cyber threats. And so we're just so delighted that you are able to join us for this conversation. Thank you for being here.
It is wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Let's dive right in. We were just talking about this a little bit outside before we came on stage. In recent years, we've seen an uptick in nation-state-backed cyber attacks against critical infrastructure. Can you provide us, from your vantage point at the White House, with your assessment of the evolving threat landscape? What kinds of cyber attacks are you tracking? Who's behind them? What are their impacts? Help paint the picture for us.
Absolutely. So we've seen three trends come together. One is greater availability of offensive cyber tools and the infrastructure to deploy them. Two, a greater set of actors, countries and criminals willing to do so. And three, more and more critical infrastructure digitally connected and available, connected to the internet. So where that plays out with regard to specific threats is a wave of ransomware criminal attacks by individuals based in Russia against hospitals, against water systems, against companies in the US and around the world. One quick data snapshot. Attacks against hospitals in the US are up 130% in the last 6 months. Significant impact, leading to ambulances being turned away from hospitals, canceled medical services, the attack we saw against the UK's major blood bank last week, in the last few weeks as well. So that's one way it plays out. The second way that plays out is with regard to China pre-positioning in critical infrastructure in the United States, in a number of Indo-Pacific countries, we believe with the goal of disrupting those systems, a port, a power system in the event of a crisis or conflict. And finally, with regard to North Korea, conducting attacks against crypto infrastructure as its core way of gleaning funds to evade the really heavy sanctions. So those three factors of more connected infrastructure, more available offensive cyber tools, more parties willing to use them, are translating into just far more disruptions in critical infrastructure around the world.
Wow. Well, listening to you speak, a couple of things stand out to me in particular. The first being that the source of the threats is there's a diversity there, and it's important to recognize that. But the second, and especially as you were talking about hospitals, water systems, energy grids, these have very real impacts on people's lives. So when we talk about, cyber attacks, recognizing the destructive impacts and the destructive potential of those is so important. When boundaries in cyberspace are so easily crossed, what strategies and tools are required for effective cyber deterrence? How has the Biden administration worked with U.S. allies to shape international norms and to strengthen preparedness?
So as you said, cyberspace has no borders. So you have many different actors operating around the world. The infrastructure in one set of countries can be used by actors in another set of countries to attack countries in a third. So how we think about building deterrence in that environment is a complex question. And the common comment I often get is people will say, we need new norms. The reality is there's a set of international cyber norms which all UN member countries signed off on, first affirmed in 2015 and signed off on again in 2019. And they lay out really significant norms in the area of cyberspace. What we've been lacking is accountability, consequences for violating those norms. And where the Biden administration has done a lot of work is first building the international partnerships in a positive way, sharing information, capacity building in cyberspace, and I'll give a couple of examples, as well as working to form coalitions to help attribute as a first step to then imposing consequences for countries who violate those norms. So in the first case, in the case of international partnerships, What we've done is, I'll give one example. The White House launched something called the International Counter-Ransomware Initiative, recognizing that criminals, largely based in Russia, were the most significant source of disruptions of infrastructure around the world. We launched this in 2021 with 30 countries. It has grown to right now where it is 68 countries around the world, from Congo to Ghana to Nigeria to Singapore to Lithuania. And countries lead different lines of work, both sharing information, helping do trainings in regional areas, reaching out to countries who are undergoing an attack to help them recover. Mm-hmm. So that's been one way the Biden administration has focused on really raising all boats. Yeah. The second one has been consequences, and I'll give two examples there. One was, so the evening before Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia conducted a cyber attack against a commercial satellite company providing communication services to Ukraine. And we worked with our European partners to attribute that attack to Russia as a first step to say attacks on critical infrastructure violate those norms. Similarly, after Iran's attack on Albania's government infrastructure, we worked with a series of partners to again call that out, because the larger the community of countries attributing an attack, the more that then we hope will join together on the second phase, which is imposing consequences.
Your point on building a broad-based coalition is really well taken for a number of reasons. As you said, it's about lifting all boats, but the other thing we know, certainly from our research at FP Analytics, the Independent Research Division of Foreign Policy, is that oftentimes cyber attackers will, launch attacks in countries you might not expect, because they're trying to see, whether it works, right? It's an experiment to run, and then they'll scale up. So that point is really well taken, as is the point that you made about international norms. And it's not just norms, it's also about international law. And there's a growing consensus that international humanitarian law does apply when we think about cyber operations that affect critical infrastructure, when we think about the protection of civilians and so on and so forth. One of the things that we've been very privileged to have the opportunity is to collaborate with you and your team for a new report that we are launching today on cyber deterrence, looking at deterrence through denial and deterrence through punishment. And this is, for those of you who are in the room, you may see these flyers on the table. This is the fourth installment of a multi-year project we have called Digital Front Lines, looking at the risks of and responses to hybrid warfare. In your essay contribution to the installment which launches today, I'm just going to quote from it, if I may. You say, and I quote, "Adversaries understand that the United States will respond to cyber attacks that cause physical impacts, just as we would respond to a kinetic attack." That's a bold statement and a really important one. So what kinds of considerations go into calibrating a proportional and timely response when you're faced with cyber attacks and cyber operations? Can you share some examples of what that looks like in practice?
Absolutely. So first, thank you for inviting me to contribute. I really appreciate the analytics arm and the research work that you've been leading here. And a product like this that has both government and private sector perspectives is so important, because the private sector both owns and operates critical infrastructure around the world, and the visibility major private firms, like I think you have a contribution from Microsoft have, there's a visibility via global sensors that gives a good picture. That's really key to that attribution. Attribution is one of the particularly hard parts of consequences in cyberspace. So to that point and to that example, you talk about deterrence by denial. One reason so many countries around the world, and the Biden administration notably, President Biden made a major shift, which is he shifted from voluntary cybersecurity standards for critical infrastructure to minimum mandates, to say, we know that there are attackers who want to disrupt pipelines, who want to disrupt airports and water systems. Citizens of a country expect those systems to be secure from those disruptions. So as government, for the first time, President Biden mandated minimum cybersecurity across a number of sectors of critical infrastructure. And frankly, those are the core questions when I engage with foreign partners. This morning, our colleagues in Italy came to visit, their first question always is, where do we start? And we always say we start with having minimum cybersecurity across critical infrastructure because we want to make it riskier, costlier, and harder for attackers, whether they're countries or criminals. The second part of that, then, is the international norms and consequences. And in order to do so, you know, in the past, when we would go to countries to say, let's attribute this attack, often countries would spend a lot of time sending back and forth technical details, when really attribution is a political decision. Does a country want to call out another country, either privately or publicly, for a cyber attack that has occurred? And then if so, what are the consequences? And the first question we ask, to your point about consequences, is what would be step 2? If we, for example, respond with a cyber attack on a country who's attacked infrastructure in the US, our goal would be to signal this wasn't acceptable and to get them to stop. Our goal is not to continue to escalate. So how we meter what that response is to convey and signal that message is often the hardest question, and really an area for ongoing research and policy work.
That point about escalation is really important, and in this compendium that we're publishing today, we actually have a contribution from Senator James Patterson of Australia, who may or may not be in the room at the moment, and he also makes this point of, you know, we have to make sure that we're avoiding a spiraling while ensuring that there's accountability as well. And indeed, that there, you know, 300% increase in Russian cyber operations targeting NATO countries between 2020 and 2022. That's a really important data point to understand that constant barrage of attacks. And at the same time, 80% of all cyber infrastructure exists on private sector operated platforms. And so before we finish our conversation, we're here, you know, on the eve of or alongside the NATO summit. I know you'll be having all kinds of important discussions and meetings and strategy sessions. So looking ahead, and as we think about what comes out of this summit, what, in your view, needs to change? For example, relating to attribution, to signaling, to international law. You've touched on these all a little bit, but what would you like to see going forward to increase that accountability and to reduce the escalation?
That's the core. That's the core and the best question is, how do we go from here? Here's the progress that's been made. How do we continue to work together in an international community to have a more secure cyberspace as our economies and our countries are more and more digitally connected? So I think the first piece is a big part of enforcing international norms is having a common way to attribute an attack. That's harder and harder as countries can use each other's covert infrastructure to launch attacks. So that's the first. What are the political standards that different countries need in order to have a common baseline for attribution? The second, what are appropriate consequences? And game playing and scenario playing, what are consequences that convey that message? Not of escalating, but of conveying that an attack in cyberspace is equivalent to an attack, a kinetic attack on critical infrastructure, and will be responded to, but in a way that, again, is non-escalatory, given more digitally connected countries are in many ways more vulnerable. And then the third is continuing to build on tighter and tighter international partnerships, like the International Counter-Ransomware Initiative, so more countries are more secure, critical infrastructure is more secure, and citizens can feel confident that they don't have to worry, is their water safe, is their power safe, even in the middle of a crisis or conflict.
That's so important indeed, especially as so many countries are looking towards that digital transformation and making sure that public services reach greater, you know, portions of the population through the digital platform, but of course, how to keep it all safe. Well, thank you so much for being here, for contributing to our project, for all of the work that you are leading at the White House and with partners around the world. Again, it's been a pleasure to have you, and thank you so much, Anne.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you. Thank you.